My name is Marin, and I was 31 the night my father decided my husband wasn't worth a handshake. We were at my parents' anniversary dinner, place cards, a string quartet, the partners from his firm, and their wives. My dad lifted his glass, looked around the table, and landed on Dev in his clean work boots. "You left law school," he said, smiling like it was a joke we were all in on, for a man who loads suitcases for a living. The table laughed. Dev set down his fork and said, quietly, that he liked the work. I didn't argue. I reached under the table, found his hand, and we finished the meal. We drove home with the windows down. People kept waiting for me to come apart. I didn't. Because there was one thing about the man I married that my father had never once thought to ask, something that had been sitting in a registry downtown for 3 years, with Dev's name at the very top of it. And in 9 months, in a ballroom full of the same people who laughed that night, it was going to be read out loud. Welcome back to Channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If a story ever finds the soft spot under your ribs, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps these stories reach the next person who needs them. I should tell you about the brass tag first, because everything I learned about people I learned from it. My grandfather, Walt, worked the ground at the old Charlotte field for 34 years. Not in an office. On the tarmac, in the rain, in the kind of August heat that comes up off the asphalt in waves. He loaded bags, then he ran a crew that loaded bags, and when he retired they gave him a clock he never wound, and he gave me the only thing he ever kept from the job, a little brass luggage tag, worn smooth, stamped with the number 47. His crew number. He pressed it into my palm when I was 9 and told me, "The people who carry things never get thanked, Mayor. Watch how a man treats them. That's the whole man." I kept that tag in my coat pocket for 20 years.
I have it on me right now.
My father, Richard, was Walt's son, and somewhere along the way he decided that the lesson of his own father's life was that you never, under any circumstances, want to be the man carrying the bag. Dad clawed his way through night school, made partner before 40, and built a firm, Caldwell and Reese, that handled corporate work for half the companies in the city. He was good at it. I'll give him that even now. He could walk into a room and read the power in it in about 4 seconds, and he reorganized himself instantly to face whoever held it. I used to think that was charm. It took me a long time to understand it was something colder than that. I grew up in a house where the question that mattered most about any person was, and what does he do? And the answer determined, immediately and permanently, how warm my father's handshake would be. Doctors and developers got the two-handed grip. Contractors and clerks got a nod. My grandfather, near the end, when his hands shook and he forgot which grandchild was which, got a kind of patient, embarrassed politeness, like Dad was waiting for him to be done. I noticed all of it. Children notice everything. They just don't have the words yet. I had the words by the time I was a teenager, and I kept my mouth shut because in my family you did well by agreeing and you suffered by arguing, and I was a careful child who wanted to do well. So, I did the thing. I went to a good college. I went to law school because that was the next rung, and because my father glowed when he told people his daughter was going to law school, and I had spent my whole life chasing that glow. I was halfway through my second year when I realized I felt nothing. Not dread, not excitement, just a long gray hum, like a refrigerator you stop hearing until it clicks off and the silence wakes you up. I want to be honest about this part because it's where my family's whole story about me began, and it was wrong from the start. I didn't fail out.
My grades were fine.
I left law school the way you leave a coat on a train, quietly, almost by accident, and then with a strange lightness once it's gone. I took a job as a paralegal at a small immigration practice downtown, $52,000 a year, and I felt my chest unclench for the first time in a decade. I was good at it. I was the person who actually read the file, who caught the missing signature, who stayed late because a family was about to be separated over a date typed wrong by someone else. My father called it throwing it away. He said it kindly, which was worse. "You have so much potential, Marin. I just don't want you to wake up at 50 and wonder." He genuinely believed he was being a good father. That's the thing I want you to understand about him before I tell you the rest. He was not a cartoon.
He thought he was protecting me.
He just could not, for the life of him, imagine that the thing I needed protection from might be him. I met Dev at the airport. Not romantically, not at first. I was picking up a client's elderly mother who'd flown in alone and gotten turned around past the baggage claim, frightened, holding a boarding pass upside down. A ramp agent in a high-vis vest had stopped what he was doing, walked her all the way to me, carried her bag, and stayed until I'd signed for her like he was personally responsible for her landing somewhere safe. He had grease on one knuckle and the calmest eyes I'd ever seen on a person. He shook my hand, and I swear to you, something in my chest went very still, the way a room goes still when the AC cuts out, and he said his name was Dev, and he hoped she had a nice visit, and he went back to the belt. I came back the next week with a coffee for him. I told myself it was a thank you. We both knew it wasn't. Dev loaded bags for Airline Airways. He'd been doing it for years. He liked the early shifts, the cold mornings, the way the work used his whole body and left his mind quiet. He read more books than anyone I'd ever met. He could fix anything. My car, my landlord's furnace, the ancient copier at my office that the company that built it had given up on. He never raised his voice. When something went wrong, he got slower and more deliberate, not faster and louder, and I had never in my life seen a man do that. Here's the thing I didn't know for almost a year, the thing that matters later. Dev never told me he was anything other than a guy who loaded bags. And I never asked because I genuinely did not care. I had grown up in a house where the first question was always what a man did and how much it was worth, and I had decided, somewhere around the time I left law school, that I was never going to be a person who asked that question again. So I didn't. I knew his favorite book and the way he took his eggs, and that he called his late mother's sister every Sunday. I knew the important things. I thought that was all there was. We married 11 months after the coffee, at the courthouse, with 2 of his co-workers and one of mine as witnesses. My grandfather had passed by then. I held the brass tag in my pocket while we said the words. I told myself Walt would have liked Dev, would have recognized him, even as one of his own. I think that's still the truest thing I know about either of them. I didn't invite my parents to the wedding. I told them after. My mother cried a little on the phone and said she wished she'd been there, and I believed her. My father went quiet on the line for a long moment, and then he said, "What does he do, Marin?" And I told him. And the temperature of his voice dropped about 10 degrees, and he said, "Well, I'm sure he's a nice man," in the exact tone he used for my grandfather at the end. For about 2 years, that was the arrangement. My parents were polite to Dev and distant with me. We saw them at holidays. My father would ask Dev questions about the airline the way you'd ask a child about school. Pleasant, uninterested, a little performed. Dev answered everything plainly and never seemed to mind. I minded. I minded enough for both of us. But I had spent my whole life keeping the peace by keeping quiet, and old habits are load-bearing. You don't notice how much they're holding up until you try to take one out. The anniversary dinner was their 35th. My mother planned it for months. She rented the private room at a restaurant downtown where my father had taken half his clients over the years, the kind of place with cloth napkins folded into shapes and a wine list that needs its own table of contents. 60 people. The partners. The clients my father wanted to be partners with. A city councilman. A string quartet in the corner that nobody listened to. My father was, that whole season, in the middle of the biggest pursuit of his career. Airline Airways, Dev's airline, though nobody at that table knew to think of it that way, was restructuring its outside legal work, consolidating it under one regional firm. The retainer was reportedly around $380,000 a year, plus the project work on top, which could run the account into the millions over a few years. For a firm like Caldwell and Reese, it would have been the single largest client they'd ever landed. My father had been chasing it for a year. He'd flown to 2 conferences just to be in the same hotel bar as Crestline's general counsel. He talked about it at dinner constantly, the way some men talk about a fish they almost caught. So you can understand the particular shape of what happened, knowing that. We arrived a little late. Dev had come straight from a shift. He'd showered and changed, but his hands still had that working man's look to them, knuckles a little raw, and he was wearing the clean boots he wore to anything where he might end up standing for hours, because he was always thinking about other people's comfort, and never his own. My father clocked the boots the second we walked in. I watched his eyes go to them, and then come back up with a smile already arranged on his face. Dinner was fine for the first hour. Then the toast started. My father is wonderful at toasts. He'd had 35 years of marriage and 4 glasses of a very good Bordeaux, and he stood, and he thanked my mother, and he thanked his partners, and then he did the thing that fathers at these dinners do, which is to go around the room and land a little affectionate joke on each member of the family. He got to me, and Dev last. "And my daughter, Marin," he said, and the warmth in his voice was real, which is what made the next part land the way it did. "Who had every door in this city open to her." He paused, and the pause was a professional's pause, a man who knew exactly how long to hold a room. "And who left law school," he smiled. He lifted his glass an inch toward Dev. "For a man who loads suitcases for a living." It wasn't a snarl. I want to be precise about this, because the cruelty of it was in the lightness. He said it the way you'd say something everyone already agreed was a little sad and a little funny. And the table laughed, not meanly, just the easy laugh of 60 people following the host's cue. The councilman laughed. My mother's smile froze on her face, but she didn't say anything. One of the partners said, "Hey, somebody's got to do it," and there was more laughing. My ears did the thing where the room goes to a hum. The back of my neck went hot, and then very cold. I felt my throat tighten around whatever I might have said, and I held still, the way I'd learned to hold still my whole life, and I waited for it to pass. Dev set down his fork. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at my father across the table, perfectly steady, and he said, "I like the work." That was all. 3 words. And then he picked his fork back up. My father, who could read a room in 4 seconds, read that one wrong. He took the calm for defeat. He gave Dev a little nod, gracious in victory, and moved on to dessert. I sat there with my hand under the table, holding Dev's, and I felt the brass tag in my coat pocket against my ribs, and I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about for 9 months. I decided I was done keeping the peace. Not loudly. Not with a scene. I was just done holding up that one particular wall. We drove home with the windows down. At a red light, Dev reached over and squeezed my knee and said, "Your dad's not a bad man. He's just been graded on the wrong curve his whole life." I didn't answer. I want to tell you about the months in the middle because they were quiet, and the quiet is the part that nobody makes videos about, but it's the part that's true. We kept saving. We found a small house we loved with a crooked porch and a maple in the yard, and we made an offer with our own money, and we got it, and we moved in, and my parents did not come to see it. My mother sent a card. Dev built a workbench in the garage and a bookshelf for the hall, and on weekends he'd come in from the garage with sawdust in his hair and that quiet, unbothered face, and I'd think, this is the most peace I have ever known, and my own family thinks I am throwing my life away. I stopped trying to be invited. I want to be honest that this was its own kind of grief, and there were nights my chest went tight in the dark, and I lay very still until it passed. I miss my mother. I even missed my father, not the man at the dinner, but the one who used to glow when he talked about me, before the glow turned out to be about what I might do rather than who I was. And then, in the spring, 2 things happened in the same week. The first, my father landed his meeting with Crestline. Finally. After a year of circling, the General Council agreed to a presentation. Caldwell and Reese against 2 other regional firms, a bake-off for the whole account. My father was, my mother told me on one of our careful phone calls, over the moon. He'd assembled a team. He'd practiced. This was the capstone, the thing that would carry the firm for a decade. The second, Dev came home from his shift, sat down at our kitchen table, turned a coffee mug around in his hands a few times the way he did when he was working up to something, and told me what he never told me. I'm going to tell it the way he told it, plainly, because that's how it was. Dev's mother had emigrated with almost nothing and worked 2 jobs and raised him alone. When he was in his 20s, before I knew him, he'd had a different life, a tech job, stock he'd been given early at a company that got bought, a payout. Not a fortune by the standards of the people at my father's dinner, but real money, more than his mother had earned in her whole life. And he'd watched what money did to people, watched it rearrange them the way it had rearranged my father, and he decided he didn't want it to rearrange him. So he did something unusual with it. He didn't spend it. He didn't flaunt it. He put almost all of it over years, quietly, into the company whose work he actually loved being part of, the airline. He bought when the stock was low, and the company was nearly grounded. when other people were running. He kept buying. He never sold. He never told anyone because the work was the point and the ownership was just a thing that was true in a registry somewhere, the way my grandfather's crew number was just a thing stamped on a piece of brass. "I'm the largest private shareholder," he said, like he was telling me he'd fix the furnace. "Have been for a while. 3 years, officially, since the last block cleared. I didn't tell you because, Mayor, you're the only person who ever liked me for loading bags. I didn't want to lose the only person who liked me for loading bags." My throat closed. I reached across the table and took his hand. I didn't say anything for a long minute, but here's what I knew, sitting at that table, that my father did not. The shares didn't have to be used. They just had to be true. And someday, in a room full of the same kind of people who'd laughed at that dinner, the truth was going to get read out loud, not by Dev, not by me, but by the company itself, in the ordinary course of its own business. Because that's what a shareholder registry is. It's a document that already exists. It just waits. The gala was in the fall. Crestline Airways was launching a new transcontinental route, and the airline threw the kind of event that airlines throw, a ballroom in the nicest hotel in the city, for 100 people, executives and city officials and major partners, and the press. And because my father's firm had, by then, won the bake-off, they'd gotten the account, the capstone, the decade maker, Caldwell and Reese was on the guest list. My father was not just attending. He was being recognized in a small way as new outside counsel. He'd been told there'd be a moment, a thank you to key partners from the stage. I knew all of this because my mother told me, breathless, on the phone, and because, and this is the part I'll own, Dev and I were also invited. Not because of who Dev was. The airline didn't make a thing of his ownership at events, by his own long-standing request. We were invited the way any employee with 12 years of service and a spouse gets invited to a company milestone, +1 on a list. Dev almost didn't want to go. I told him we were going. I held the brass tag in my pocket when I said it. We arrived early. My parents arrived later. My father in a tuxedo, my mother lovely and nervous, and when they saw us across the ballroom, my father's face did a complicated thing. Surprise, then a quick recalibration, then a tight social smile. He came over. He shook Dev's hand. One hand. The nod. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said pleasantly, and there was an edge under it, the edge of a man who'd worked very hard to be in this room and didn't love finding the suitcase loader in it too. 12 years with the company, Dev said. "They invite the long-timers." "Of course," my father said. "Of course they do." And he steered my mother away to a table near the front, with the executives, where the new outside counsel sat, and we took our seats further back, with the operations staff and the ground crews, which is exactly where Dev wanted to be, among his own. I'll tell you the truth about how I felt in that hour before it happened, because it wasn't triumph. It was a low, steady drum behind my ribs. I kept my eyes on my father at the front table, laughing with the executives, leaning in, doing the thing he did, reorganizing himself around the power in the room, and the whole time the power in the room was sitting next to me eating a dinner roll, and my father had no idea, and I felt the floor under me feel very solid for the first time in years. The program started. There were speeches. The CEO, a plain-spoken woman named Adrienne Salas, who'd come up through operations herself and never let anyone forget it, talked about the new route, about the crews, about the people who, in her words, actually move this airline, the ones on the ramp at 4 in the morning. Dev's co-workers at our table cheered. My father, at the front, clapped politely, the way you clap for a sentiment you find quaint. Then she said there was one more thing she wanted to do before dinner, something a little unusual, and the room settled. She said that the company had reached a milestone year, and that the board had wanted to do something they'd never done at a public event, to formally recognize the long-term private shareholders who had stood by Crestline through its hardest stretch, the people who'd bought in when the company was nearly grounded and never sold. Loyalty like that built this airline, she said, and we don't say thank you to it nearly enough. I felt Dev go very still beside me. He hadn't known they were going to do this. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. In particular, Adrienne said, and she had a card in her hand now, an actual card, the kind of document that already exists. I'd like to recognize our single largest private shareholder, Someone who, I'm told, has asked for exactly none of this for over a decade, and who I have personally never been allowed to thank. Tonight I'm going to thank him anyway.
A few people laughed.
She looked down at the card. I'm told he's in the room. And I'm told, she smiled, that he came as somebody's +1. The room did a soft, curious murmur. People started glancing around. I watched my father. He was smiling toward the stage, indulgent, waiting for some name from his own world, some developer or financier he could recalibrate toward. Adrian read the name off the card.
Dev.
Would you stand up? And the room went looking, and the spotlight a kid from the AV table was running swung back, past the executive tables, past my father, all the way to the back, to the operations tables, and it stopped on a man in clean boots who set down his dinner roll, and stood and lifted one hand in a small, embarrassed wave to 400 people. I have tried for a long time to describe what happened to that ballroom in the second after he stood, and the closest I can get is this. It was the sound of 400 people rearranging everything they'd assumed, all at once, very quietly. A long breath let out across the whole room. Chairs turned. And then the applause started. At our table first, his crew, on their feet, then spreading, until the whole ballroom was standing for the man who loaded their bags, who'd never told any of them, who'd bought in when everyone else ran.
I didn't stand.
I sat very still and watched my husband be thanked, and I felt the tag against my ribs, and something behind my eyes went hot, and I let it. I let myself look at my father exactly once. He had gone the color of the tablecloth. His mouth had come open a little. He was staring at the back of the room, at the man in the clean boots he'd toasted at his own anniversary dinner, the man he'd called a suitcase loader to make 60 people laugh, the man who, he was doing the math now. I could see him doing the math, the 4-second red finally failing him, owned more of the company he'd spent a year chasing than any single person at the front tables. His hand was flat on the table, like he needed it to stay upright. He didn't clap. He couldn't. Beside him, my mother had a hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes had found me across the room, and I'll tell you what was in them, because it surprised me. It wasn't shock. It was something closer to recognition, like a part of her had always known, and was only now allowed to. Dev sat back down as fast as he politely could and stared at his plate, mortified, whispering to me, I'm going to kill Adrian, which, given the survival rules of my entire life, made me laugh out loud at exactly the wrong moment, and a few people at our table laughed with me, and that was the only sound I made the whole night. I never said a single word to my father in that ballroom. I want you to understand that. I didn't walk to the front table. I didn't gloat. The room did all of it. The document, the registry, the thing that had been true and quiet for 3 years did all of it. I just sat in my seat next to my husband and let it be read out loud, the way Mr. Hartley had told me, months before, that discretion eventually gets read out loud, and it had better hold up. It did not, for my father, hold up. The rest came over the following weeks, and it came the way these things come, socially first, then financially, in deniable, mortifying pieces. The social part was instant, and it was brutal in the way only a room like that can be brutal. My father had spent a year performing his importance to people who had just watched him live, that he'd insulted the airline's largest owner at his own dinner table and bragged about it. The story moved through that world by the next morning. I don't have to tell you how a story like that moves. By the end of the week, my father was, in the eyes of the people whose eyes he'd spent his life arranging himself for, the man who'd called Dev a baggage handler. The financial part was quieter and worse. Crestline's general counsel called my father's firm, I later learned, not to fire them. Dev never asked anyone to fire them. I need you to hear that. He stayed out of it exactly as he'd promised, but the account was new and not yet papered, and in the way of these things, a review was initiated and then a pause, and then the work simply began flowing to one of the other firms from the bake-off, the way water finds the lower channel. The $380,000 retainer and the project work behind it never fully landed. The decade maker became the one that got away, again, except this time, everyone knew why. 2 of the partners who'd been counting on it were unhappy. My father, standing at his own firm, the firm with his name on the door, took the kind of hit that men his age don't fully recover from. And then my father called me, himself this time. Not a letter on letterhead. Him. I let it ring twice before I answered, not for drama, just because my hand had gone still on the phone and I needed a second. When I picked up, there was a long silence, and then my father, who had never once in 31 years asked me for anything, said, in a voice I didn't recognize, "Marin, I think I've made a terrible mistake, and I was hoping you and Dev might be willing to sit down with me."
He didn't ask about the airline.
I'll give him that much. He didn't try to use me as a string to pull. But it was all there in the asking, the standing he wanted back, the meeting he wanted, the door he wanted reopened. "We need to be a family again," he said, and the word need did a lot of work in that sentence, more work than he meant it to. I didn't yell. I didn't list his sins. I had thought for 9 months about what I'd say, and when the moment came it turned out to be very short. "I married a good man, Dad," I said. You laughed at him. He was quiet. "Dev's not angry," I said because it was true. Dev doesn't do angry. Dev does slower and more deliberate. He'd shake your hand tomorrow. He'd mean it. That's who he is. I felt my throat go tight, and I let the silence hold a second. But you should know it wouldn't be, because of who he turned out to own. He was the same man at your dinner table. You just couldn't see him. So before you sit down with us, I need you to be able to tell me you understand that. Not that you're sorry he's rich. That you're sorry you couldn't see him. My father started to say something about the firm, about the account, about how he'd never have, and then he stopped himself mid-sentence, and there was a long breath on the line, and he said, very low, "I don't know if I can, but I'd like to learn how." It wasn't an apology. It was closer to the truth than an apology, which is rarer. We did sit down eventually, the three of us, at our kitchen table with the crooked porch outside. It was awkward and slow and real. My father shook Dev's hand at the door, 2 hands, for the first time, and I don't think he even knew he'd done it. He's not a finished man. He's not a redeemed one, tied up neat. He still reaches for the question of what a person does before he reaches for the person. But he's trying to catch himself now, and a few times I've watched him stop the question in his own mouth, and that's more than I ever thought I'd get. My grandfather was right about the whole thing. You watch how a man treats the people who carry things. That's the whole man. My father spent his life sorting people by what they carried, and never once noticed that the man carrying the bags owned the plane. That's my story. A brass tag stamped 47, a pair of clean work boots, and a name read out loud in a room full of people who finally went quiet. So let me ask you something, and I really do want to know. If you'd been at that dinner table, 60 people, the laugh already going around, would you have said something in the moment, the way I never could? Or would you have done what Dev did, and what I finally learned to do, stay quiet and let the truth show up on its own schedule? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.